Let's take a look at the global dimensions of supply chains. Specifically, we'll look at the rationale for global trade, the contributing factors to global commerce, how supply chains figure in, a little bit of a micro perspective, and also supply chain security and the role of ports.
Energetic, they're amazing. I was saying, make America great again. I actually think we can say now, and I really believe this, we're going to get things coming. We're going to get Apple to start building their damn computers and things in this country instead of in other countries.
So should Apple be building computers in this country? Well, you know what? We're not the first people to ask that question. And in fact, it was addressed in the 18th century by Adam Smith. In his renowned treatise, The Wealth of Nations, he provided not only a rationale for a market economy based upon competition, but also advanced a rationale for trade among nations called the theory of absolute advantage. Smith argued that countries would be better off if they would trade commodities where each country had an economic or cost advantage for one or more of the products that they produced. The underlying logic of absolute advantage was also used by Adam Smith to advance the rationalization of what he called division of labor or specialization of labor. So we'll have a chance in the discussion forum to unpack absolute advantage as it applies to Apple and where they produce their products. And I think that will be a very, very fruitful discussion. But it sort of begs the question, well, let's take a hypothetical and say the United States is better at producing, both manufactured goods and let's say pharmaceuticals. Well, in that case, should the United States produce both? And a lot of times people would say yes, but let me give you a different analogy or comparison. So let's say that Jamie is the best lawyer in town. And like a guy friend of mine from college, let's say he's also the best typist in town. Should he do his own typing? Well, that's very analogous to should the United States produce everything? Well, let's unpack that. Let's say, what does the average lawyer in Long Beach make? Actually, it's a lot. The lowest paid attorney in Long Beach makes about $300 an hour. What about a secretary or a typist? Well, a really good one could pull down maybe $30 an hour. So what is Jamie giving up by doing all of his own typing? Well, in fact, he's giving up $270 an hour. That's pretty challenging. So even if the United States can produce, let's say, apparel, and we can produce pharmaceuticals have a huge margin. And we've got a competitive advantage in producing pharmaceuticals in that we've got a lot of technical know-how and we've got a lot of capital in this country. Wouldn't it make more sense to allow a country that has a competitive advantage, let's say because low wages, to produce apparel, to focus on those goods and focus on the goods that we are comparatively better at? So I'm going to include an entertaining clip on Gilligan's Island that I think makes that point a little bit better. And let's look at some contributing factors for global flows and trade. Specifically, population size and distribution, urbanization, land resources, technology and information, and the globalized economy. The top 10 countries in the world account for 60% of the total world population. So which two countries account for about 36% of the total? Yes, it is China and India. The US is a distant third, and China and India have over 4 times as many people as the US. Another interesting statistic is that India is projected to have a larger population than China by 2050, and that Russia, which is number 9 in the graphic that you just saw, and Japan at number 10, are projected to have fewer people in 2050 than they had in 2015. The sheer size of the populations in China and India will provide these two countries with a potential economic advantage in terms of labor for growth, as long as the economies can support that population size. The decrease in size for Russia and Japan reflects an aging population and has the potential of being an economic disadvantage in terms of labor availability and the social cost to supporting an aging population. Let's take a look at median age in the graphic. What do you notice? Well, the median age is increasing, with one exception, over the course of the 4 years for all categories. Developed countries have the highest median age in each year, and the least developed countries have the lowest median age. The differences are generally explained by the level of education, quality of healthcare, and economic well-being. The difference in median age between the most developed and the least developed is interesting to note. It's 21 years in 2010 and in 2025, but drops to a projected 18 years by 2050. Overall, however, the challenge is evident that the more developed countries have a lower birth rate and an aging citizenry, which has implications for future economic development and prosperity. Japan and 3 European countries are projected to have populations with median ages over 50. The aging population in these countries will result in increased healthcare costs and a reduction in the size of the working population. This could result in a lowering of labor productivity and increased taxes. Consider the fact that by 2030, longevity in South Korea is projected to be age 90. That's pretty amazing. Migration to countries with aging populations is a possibility if it's not constrained. So take a country like Japan that's facing huge costs because they have so many seniors. They've got a challenge because they discourage immigration. So from the perspective of world business and global supply chains, this data has some important implications relative to economic growth, market size and development, capital flows, labor availability, consumer needs, and utilization of natural and strategic resources. A related issue is urbanization, with the increase of migration in many countries from rural areas to cities or urban areas. As one would expect, this shift will be most profound in the less and least developed countries of the world. The United Nations projects that by 2025, 50% or more of the total Asian population will be in cities, with China having the largest urban population. A new category of city has been identified, namely megacities, those with 10 million or more inhabitants, which is a manifestation of the migration to urban areas. One of the interesting and important dimensions of the new megacities is where they will develop. Two other factors of production, land and resources, are also important for economic advancement and development. These are general terms and would include such items as food, energy, and water, which are critical for economic viability and future development. Technology can play an important role in mitigating scarcity of key resources, from desalination of ocean water and fracking for gas and oil production, to biotechnology for improving crop yield and agricultural production. Public and private sector collaboration and partnerships can be very instrumental in alleviating global economic disparities that currently exist around the world. Investment in infrastructure will be required, but most important will be the elimination of terroristic acts, along with economic and political stability. Technology has two important dimensions. It can be viewed as an internal change agent that can enhance organizational efficiency and effectiveness and enhance the ability to compete in the global marketplace. Technology, however, can also be viewed as an external driver of change similar to globalization. In fact, one could argue that its external role in recent years has moved technology ahead of globalization as an agent or driver of change. The rapid development of new technology, whether it be hardware or software, has changed the rules of engagement and enabled new sources and forms of competition, especially new business models. The availability and sharing of such information has become a major force for driving competition and the development of new business models, as we said. A very important outcome of these developments has been the opportunity for expanding global participation with efficient and effective supply chains via outsourcing to other countries of the world. It has made it possible for relatively small companies to participate in some of the processes and expand their footprint. Looking at the map with its numerous circles indicating exports or outflow of merchandise, it reflects both good news and bad news. The good news is the number of countries participating in exporting or global commerce. The bad news is the disparity among the countries in terms of volumes of exports. Certainly, some of this is attributable to the size of the country, its stage of economic development, and the value of the merchandise being exported. But the concentration of economic power is obvious. The table indicates that the European Union as a whole, with its 28 countries, is the leader in terms of exports. Now, this listing may seem unfair to you, but the total geographic size of the EU is smaller than of Russia and China, for example, and it's considered an economic entity. Also, it's interesting to note that in spite of their relatively small geographic size, 4 European countries are among the top 9 countries on the list. Overall, the EU is an important component of the global economy and a major economic force. China is the leading individual exporting country, followed by the United States, which exports about 30% less than China. The US is followed closely by Germany, and Japan is a somewhat distant fourth on the list. It's also interesting to note that the Republic of Korea and Hong Kong both compare favorably with Italy and France in terms of their exports. If the table were expanded to include the top 12, the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation would make the list at 11th and 12th, respectively. Let's take a look at import trade flows of merchandise. The related table provides data on the volume of imports moving into various countries. Again, the EU is at the top of the list, but the US and China have changed positions, with the US being number 2. The two tables indicate China's position as a net exporter and the US as a net importer. Keep in mind, however, that these tables are showing merchandise flows and are not the equivalent of the balance of payments, which also reflects financial flows. The trade data, in terms of value, is the most relevant to the current discussion for global supply chains, but one could argue that the actual physical volume of the flows could also be important from a supply chain perspective. An overall comparison of imports and exports is interesting. Note the data for China and Germany in terms of exports versus imports. Let's take a look at U.S. total exports and top export partners. The table shows the total exports of the U.S. and their top 25 export partners for 2014. Canada, Mexico, and China are the top 3 recipients of exports from the United States, in that order. Japan is a distant fourth with about half of what it exported to China. And China only receives about half of what it exported to Mexico. Canada is by far the most important trading partner of the U.S. in terms of exports. Note that 6 European countries are in the top 25, and an array of Asian and South American countries, for the most part, complete the list. As indicated, the U.S. is a major global exporting country, with some concentration of trade with its 2 closest neighbors, but also with a broad reach throughout the world. Let's take a look at U.S. total imports and top import partners. The U.S. imports presented in this table indicate a counterbalancing global flow, as one might expect. However, in this case, China is the top partner, followed by Canada and Mexico